In the meantime, then, welcome everyone. We are so glad that you're here to support authors and local readers and, of course, Grassroots, hopefully your favorite indie bookstore in Corvallis. I'm Ashley, the events and social media coordinator at Grassroots, and I am very excited to be here. Tonight we have the author and conservationist Jonathan Slaght. So I'm going to give a brief introduction for him to those of you who are unfamiliar with his work, and then we can move on to describing sort of how this is all going to work. Jonathan Slaght is the Russia and Northeast Asia coordinator for the Wildlife Conservation Society, where he manages research projects on endangered species and coordinates avian conservation activities along the East Asia-Australasia Flyway from the Arctic to the tropics. His work has been featured by the New York Times, The Guardian, the BBC World Service, NPR, Smithsonian Magazine, Scientific American, and Audubon Magazine, among others. In Owls of the Eastern Ice, Jonathan brings us on a fascinating quest to find and save the world's largest species of owl during a period spanning 5 years. Equally valuable for its entertainment as it is for its conservation efforts, Owls of the Eastern Ice is a rare glimpse into the fieldwork on an even rarer owl, written by a scientist fully aware of the enormity of this undertaking. It also just recently appeared on the 2020 National Book Awards long list. So, that all being said, here's how this is going to work. Jonathan's going to give a presentation, and then we're going to move into a Q&A from audience members. Feel free to write out if you have a question or even what the question is in the chat box throughout the presentation. And then once we get to the Q&A, I'll be able to call on you to start asking questions. And of course, feel free to add messages to the chat whenever something doesn't work right or if you just need to share something. And also, I will be posting the link to my Owls of Eastern Ice in the chat as well. So that all being said, Jonathan, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. I have to say, so I've given a number of these talks, and I prefer these relatively smaller gatherings where I can see your faces, and I get it's more like the old-fashioned style of giving a book presentation rather than kind of talking to a black screen. And I never know what people are thinking or how they're responding to what I'm saying. So it's nice to see, well, I guess half of your faces. All right, so I'm gonna just go straight in. Hello, thanks for doing that. I'm gonna just start my presentation. This will be about 25 minutes, and then we'll get into some questions if you have any about the book or about anything really. Okay, so I wrote a book about an owl, and it's probably unlike any owl that you've seen before. This is a Blakiston's fish owl, and these are really big birds. They stand about as tall as a fire hydrant. They have these 6-foot wingspans, and they weigh the equivalent of about 11 crows. But the book is more than just about owls. It's about people, the people who share the same forests that the owls live in. It's a book about field work. And it's a book about a place where humans are decidedly not in control. Nature is. And so really over the next 25 minutes, I'll tell you why this owl is special, why it's special to me, and why I've spent 15 years of my life studying it. And then I'll go into some of the events that take place in the book. But first, I want to give you just a little bit of background. So this is a story that takes place in Primoria, Russia, which is way over here in the Russian Far East, in a province called Primoria. People that live in this entire province, half of whom are in the capital city of Vladivostok, which is down in the south. But most of the province is dotted with small villages like this, where populations can be measured in thousands, hundreds, and in some cases even dozens. And the villages are really where they can fit between the Sikhateli and river. So it is a large mountainous province, really spectacular coastline. I mean, often when I show people photographs of the Russian Far East, and they have trouble believing this is Russia. I haven't spent much time in the Pacific Northwest. I understand you guys have fantastic coastline, but people don't think of this type of thing when they think of Russia. It's also a region of absolute fantastic wildlife. More tigers here, also called tigers, and there's brown bears. This is the only place in the world you have brown bears and tigers sharing the same forests. And they do sometimes kill each other. So this is where I was. I was in Primoria, kind of when the book starts. Peace Corps in the year 2000, in a small village called Lazo, in the south of Primoria. And I'm going to read just the first paragraph of the book to really to set the scene. I saw my first Blackasin's fish owl in the Russian province of Primoria, a coastal talon of land south into the belly of Northeast Asia. This is a remote corner of the world, not far from Russia and North Korea meet in a tangle of mountains and barbed. On a hike in the there in 2000, a companion and I flushed and panicked. Taken to the air with labored flaps, it hooted its displeasure, then landed for a moment, perhaps a dozen meters above our heads. This disheveled mass of wood chip brown regarded us warily with electric yellow eyes. We were uncertain at first which bird actually we'd come across. It was clearly an owl, but bigger than any I'd seen. About the size of an eagle, but fluffier, portly, with enormous ear tufts. Backlit by the hazy gray of a winter sky, it seemed almost too big and too comical to be a real bird, as if someone had hazed fistfuls of feathers to a yearling bear, then propped the dazed beast in a tree. Having decided that we were a threat, the creature pivoted to escape, crashing through the trees as its 2-meter wingspan clipped the lattice of branches. Flakes of displaced bark spiraled down as the bird flew out of sight. So this was the pre-digital days, and I was about a 4-hour bus ride from where I could get film developed. So I take those photos I just showed you were the photos I took of that bird, and it was a number of weeks before I actually had the images in my hand and could then positively identify it as a Blackasin's fish owl. So these are weird birds, and even among owls, they're bizarre. And there's a few reasons for that, which I'll get into. So when you look at other owl species, one attribute that's commonly attributed to owls is their exceptional hearing. And the reason they have such good hearing is if you look at their faces, they have these their feathers are this disc shape. And what that does is that channels the sound directly to their ear holes, so that some owls, such as these barn owls at the bottom, can hunt their prey in pitch darkness. If you look at a fish owl face, and sure, there's a bit of a facial disc there, but it's not nearly as defined as a typical owl species. Another attribute commonly attributed to owls is silent flight. And that's because of their feather structure. So we look at this flight feather here. This is from a wing of a Eurasian eagle owl. If you look at the top there, there are all these protrusions, all these little barbs sticking up off the top of the feather. And what those do essentially is act as, when the owl flaps its wings, the air hits those barbules first and they dissipate the air. So making, almost giving the owl like a cloaking device. So as it flaps its wings, the air is pushed away before it hits the wing and can then move silently. We look at a Blackasin's fish owl primary feather, those are absolutely lacking. You can hear fish owls flying. And if we think about why this might be, like why do fish owls not have acute hearing, and why are they loud? Why are they not silent when they fly? Think about what they're hunting and where they're hunting. They sit in ambush along these rocky riverbanks that are loud, and the water is just rushing past over these rocks. And imagine if you were a barn owl with this super hypersensitive hearing, you'd probably go crazy trying to catch a fish because it would just be too loud. And what does a fish care if an owl is flapping around in the trees or not? A fish can't hear it. So I think over time, fish owls lost these traits that are common with other owls that help them in hunting terrestrial prey. So there are really two features of a landscape that these fish owls need to live happy fish owl lives. The first thing is a really big hole in a really big tree. Because the owls are so big, they need these trees that are meter and a half in diameter around. And for a tree to get that big, it has to be 200 or 300 years old. Here's two examples of where fish owl nests are in these trees, really, really high up in these Japanese poplars. Now, the other thing a fish owl needs is access to prey in winter. So these are birds that don't migrate. So they're living in the same forest patches year in and year out. And it gets cold there. It dips to the -30s easily in winter, and most waterways freeze. So if you're a fish specialist living in a place where most water freezes, you need to find places that water doesn't freeze. And there are a number of radon hot springs in the province where there's gas, this slightly warm gas is hitting the main, seeping into the main channel of the river. And so in those specific patches, the water remains unfrozen year in and year out. So if you have, if you're in Primoria and you come across a patch of forest in winter where there's big trees and there's open water like this with lots of fish in it, that's just really good fish owl habitat. Now, looking back historically, there weren't very many conflicts between the needs of fish owls, the big trees and the fish, and humans. These images are of indigenous Udege, indigenous to Primoria, and they would sometimes hunt fish owls in autumn because the fish owls would put on these thick fat reserves, as a lot of animals do, in anticipation of winter, and that's when they would catch them because they then eat these big fatty birds. And they would also stretch out their wings or use their tails as fans, as you can see in that bottom picture there. But we're talking about very, very minimal hunting pressure there. And even into the Soviet Union, there wasn't much pressure. So this map here is just of Ternay County, the northernmost county in Primoria, and where most of the book takes place. And even as recently as 1984, toward the end of the Soviet Union, there were very few roads. It was mostly wilderness. So fewer than 150 miles of road in 1984. And then fast forward 20 years, and suddenly there's this explosion of roads throughout the county, up to nearly 3,000 miles of road. So we went from centuries of almost no conflict between fish owls and humans to suddenly the prospect of significant conflict between us and them. And so despite the sudden emergence of threats and fish owls being endangered, like federally listed in Russia as endangered, there are no plans to mitigate these problems. So just like in the United States, there are laws protecting endangered species where if you know where an endangered species lives, you can't harm it or its habitat. But because there were no such plans for fish owls, they weren't really being protected. And so this was really the core of my PhD project at the University of Minnesota, which I started in 2005. And I hooked up with these two guys. They're both named Sergey, Sergey Avdyuk and Sergey Surmush. And these two fellows had been working together for about a decade before I got involved, since the mid-1990s, to look for fish owls in Primoria. So they lacked, so they were interested in understanding more about fish owls, but they lacked expertise in some of the more technical aspects of a real research study of fish owls, and they lacked time. They just weren't really able to do as much as they wanted to. So we formed a partnership where we would find some fish owls, we would catch them, we would put GPS backpacks on them, use that information to find out where they were going, and then put that together and form a conservation plan from that information. So we broke the project into 3 parts, and this is really, the book is in 3 parts. The first stage was just a 2-week expedition to the northernmost part of Primoria, and and it was so remote that you couldn't drive there. You had to fly in by helicopter. And I was met here by the rest of the team, including Sergey Avdeyuk and two others. And the plan was to go from the one village that I flew into, snowmobile down the frozen river, because there were no roads. The only travel corridor is the river, to the coast where there's another village. And in that 80 kilometers of interim space, look for fish owls. So we strapped everything we had to two snowmobiles. You can see skis and tents and a barrel of fuel, and just went down the river. So for me, like, the purpose of this exercise for me was really to get a feel for fish owl fieldwork. I hadn't seen one since. So this was 2000. This was March 2006. So I hadn't seen one since that first encounter, 6 years earlier. I didn't know what I was looking for. These guys did. So they were really teaching me what to look for and how to study fish owls. So there were really three things that we were looking for that these guys were teaching me to find. The first thing is that anytime we'd see some open water in winter, immediately train the binoculars on it, look for tracks. Fish owls can be surprisingly hard to detect, even though they could be living in this part of the forest for years. They're really good at kind of staying off the radar of humans. They tend to fly away if a human gets within 150 yards of them. But in winter, they can't help but leave tracks in the snow as they're kind of walking up and down the riverbank looking for a good spot to wait in ambush for a fish. So, and this could be useful information for later in the study when I'm off looking for new fish owls to find. So anytime we find a patch of open water, look for tracks, and that lets us know if there's fish owls there or not. The second thing to look for is feathers. Fish owls seem to be constantly releasing these semi-plumed feathers that are they're like this big. They're these semi-plumes that look almost like silvery sausages. And especially in winter when there's no leaves on the trees, these catch on branches. And if the sun's just right, it's almost like a little neon flag flapping in the wind to just tell you that there's fish owls there. So if you see one of those, it's time to start looking for a nest tree. And that's the third thing we were looking for. Anytime we'd come across one of these massive old growth, 200-300-year-old trees, and train the binoculars up, look for a hole, and if it looked promising, maybe try to get up there and see if it's a fish owl nest or not. So the plan was to really, for this first part of the expedition and of the book, it was really, the idea was to kind of take our time and go down the river and really do a good job. But what we were finding was there were all these delays, and it turned out that we were really overstaying winter's welcome. As March turned into April, there's a lot of melt going on, and we came across these things that I call knollids in the book, which is this. You can sort of see this band of water crossing the river channel, and it's just where somewhere upstream something's melted and water is flowing atop the river ice. But really, I mean, when you're standing there looking at it, you don't know if it's only a foot deep, half a foot deep, or if you step on that, you're just gonna sink right to the river bottom. And so these things really became a challenge. Like, this one's easy to cross; it's short, but some are really quite wide. I have a video of us trying to get across one here, to give you a better sense of what these things look like. So we didn't make that one, but there were no alternatives other than to go through, pretty much, because we had to move forward. The further we went, the more ice, like big sheets of ice, were breaking off into the river behind us, completely blocking our path back. In some cases, we came across these that were so wide, or in some places that was just definitely open water, that we had to take a chainsaw and cut trails along the bank through that type of forest you can see in the back to bypass the obstacle to get back on the river. And really, toward the end, we just gave up all hope of looking for owls and just booked it for the coast, just to make sure we could get off the river, because if we got stuck, we were stuck. So the second phase of the project, which is part 2 of the book, was relatively, much more mellow in comparison. This was just me and Sergey up the Yuk driving around that road network that I showed you before, revisiting some sites that he had seen in some fish out territories he'd been to in the past, just to see if there were still birds there, and we could add these to our list of birds we were going to try to catch the next year. And so we'd either sleep in tents or we'd stay in these hunter cabins that we'd come across. And then the third year was when the next year, next winter of 2007, which is part 3 of the book, was really where things got serious. So we had identified territories we were going to try to catch owls. We went to do it. Again, just me and Sergey, living in a tent in the woods in winter. We had these different traps at these territories where we found owls, and we just tried to catch some owls. And it really took quite a while, months, I think, to catch our first owl. It was a lot of trial and error, really an unpleasant experience for me, both physically, because I mean, this is, I was outside for just weeks at a time, but then also psychologically, because we're trying to catch these birds. We're not sleeping well because we're up all night waiting to see if the birds are going to come into our traps, and we're spending our days kind of just wandering around, tinkering with the traps, trying to figure out why they're not working. So this is a tent that we slept in. And I remember one night, laying there in my sleeping bag. Sergey is in the sleeping bag next to me, and it's one of these -30 nights, just absolutely freezing. And so my sleeping bag is completely cinched, so the only thing that you can see is my nose and a little bit of my upper lip. And it was so cold that our breath was freezing to the interior of the tent. And anytime one of us would twitch just a little bit, it would rain this light mist of ice onto my nose and my upper lip. And I remember thinking, just like, what am I doing here? Because it was pretty awful. After a little bit, so Sergey and I are still living in a tent, having no luck. We run into this guy. He was a hermit, a 9-fingered hermit who was living in an abandoned hydroelectric station that happened to be right between 2 territories where we'd been trying to catch owls. And he was like, yeah, come live with me. I've got an extra room. So that was great. We had a warm place to sleep. He was weird, but he was good company. He was really friendly, and he was happy to make us food. And so that eased some of the tension, because at least we had a warm place to go into. And one thing that I want to make clear is that so the conditions of the field work are really similar to just conditions of rural life over there. If people want water, they go to the river with a bucket. If they want fish, they drill a hole and dip in their line. And until we ran into Anatoly the hermit. I mean, if we want food, dig out some snow, find some wood, and boil some water to make food. And so it was during that first winter field season that I really started to keep a more detailed journal, and that's really what became the core of the book. I tried to spend, it was a very immersive Russian experience. I mean, I speak Russian fluently, but nonetheless, I mean, being in Russia, surrounded by Russians, speaking only Russian for weeks. I was longing to be able to express myself in my native language, and being able to put aside a half hour, 40 minutes, whenever I could a day, to put in earplugs, sit somewhere and just write down my observations of the day. Some weird thing that Anatoly said, or some troubles you were having with capturing owls. And then years later, so it's probably 2015, when I thought maybe I can turn this into a book. I took all those notes, put them into one PDF, and that was 40 pages of text. And then I just kind of expanded from that. And the book really essentially wrote itself in just a few months after I put all that stuff together, at least the first draft, because all the experiences were really already there. So right toward the end of the first field season in 2007, started to catch owls. We put together different combinations of different traps, and finally we hit on a winning combination, and we're able to. We ended up catching 4 birds that first season, which was our initial target, and 3 of those, and I think it was just a couple of days. It was pretty quick. But even having birds in hand, there were still adventures. I'm going to read just a paragraph here. So in this photo here, so Sergey is holding the bird and I'm putting on the band. And in this story, it's the other way around, where I'm holding the bird and Sergey is putting on the band. As I took over restraining the owl for Sergey to fit leg bands, a deer head emerged from the owl's breast feathers. This is a flat-bodied parasitic insect about the size of a dime with long, stout legs. Named for the mammals it often parasitizes, deer heads land on a prospective host, then work through the thick hair, or feathers, to lie flush against the skin, surviving in this microcosm of blood and body heat even in cold winters. I'd seen plenty of these insects over the years, but it had not occurred to me that they might live on owls. It must have decided that the bird was a sinking ship and was entertaining other options. Hey, I said to Sergey, looking at the insect with curiosity, there's a deer head. Sergey, focused on crimping the metal of a leg band, grunted distractedly in response. The fly started moving my way. I was unable to counter its slow approach. I held the owl's legs with one hand and its wings closed with the other. If I let go, the owl might hurt itself and put a talon through Sergey's hand. Hey, I said again, with rising alarm as the fly crawled from the owl to my arm, then up to my shoulder to reach my bare neck. By this point, I was bellowing. I felt the insect find and then burrow deep into my beard, where it nestled against my jaw. There was nothing I could do but swear in Russian with as much color as I could muster and implore a now laughing Sergey to take control of the owl. When he did, I plucked the deer head from my face and flicked it as far away as I could into the snow. So if you look at this owl here, you might be able to make out something different on its back, and that's the GPS. So these are little devices that, they really fit like backpacks. There's straps that go over and under the wing, and the device just sits right in the middle of the back. They're pretty light. And what this does is it receives a one or two GPS signals a day for about a year, depending on how it's programmed. And then the trick there is that we have to recapture that same bird at some point in the future. For us, it was a year to actually access the data. But these are long-lived birds. There's a record of a bird that's nearly 30 years old that lives in Japan, where the birds are super endangered. And they also, because they're so big, they don't really have natural predators. So we figured there was a good chance that we'd be able to recapture the same birds a year later, and we were always able to. So then in field seasons 2008, 2009, 2010, Sergey and I got more serious, and instead of just working as the two of us and essentially in a tent and living and driving around in his pickup truck, we started living in this thing, a GAZ 66, and driving this to much more remote places and really using this as a field base. There's almost like a 2-bedroom apartment on the back there with a wood stove. You can see the pipe sticking up off the back. And we drive this almost as far as the road would take us sometimes, park it, and then go further either on foot or on snowmobile. And we had a revolving cast of field assistant characters throughout the years. It was always me and Sergey of the Uke, and then sometimes we'd have some of these other guys. Some would be there for a few seasons, some would just be there for a few weeks. So here I am with Andre and Shurik in the back of the GAZ, parked next to a river. And this was you can see it's a little tight space sleeping wise. We had 5 people, up to 5 people sleeping in here at times. And I was leading this weird double life during this period. I'd be doing field work in Russia. I'd get off a plane in Vladivostok and would just speak Russian for 3 months, hanging out with these guys in a truck. And then I'd go back to Minnesota, where I do normal things like go bowling and get married. And then I'm get off a plane in Vladivostok and back in the truck with Shurik and Andre doing owl stuff. So it was a weird. No one from either life could really understand what was happening in the other life. So, and so my girlfriend at the time was now my wife. You know, I kept some of the details of some of the adventures from her because it would definitely worry her. And so, you know, when she was reading the book for the first time, there were a lot of "you did what?" Because she was finding out about it for the first time. So one thing I would definitely like to underscore is really how remote some of this work was. I mean, yes, we're on a road network, but you know, Ternate County has 10,000 people living in it. It's this huge area. And if something happens, you're pretty much on your own. And, you know, this photo here, we'd been driving on, this is Sergey's pickup truck. We've been driving on this abandoned logging road in really deep snow. And so we didn't notice that we'd hit some stick or something and completely punctured the tire, and it was absolutely 100% flat. But then we kept driving on it because we couldn't tell, because the road was so bad anyway, you couldn't really tell that the tire was completely flat. And so because we kept driving on it, the tire ended up becoming unseated from the rim. And typically, I have poor understanding of mechanics, but as Sergey was explaining it, typically you need an actual machine to reseat that. And we were in, you know, right here, we're 80 kilometers from the closest human settlement. And that human settlement has, you know, 250 people in it. It's just a hunting village. And so they probably don't have what we need. So I was really lucky to have Sergey with me all these years, because he's remarkably handy in the field. So his solution to our problem here was to pour gasoline inside the rim and then light it on fire. And then the resulting explosion should reseat it back on. And it worked. So I have a little video of that. It all happens pretty fast. So once it was reseated, he was able to find the hole, patch it, and then we were on our way. And this is just one of, honestly, probably dozens of examples of Sergey doing something that meant I got to leave. You know, I would probably still be there if not for him. I mean, the GOZ 66 was constantly breaking down. There were always problems with it. And so, you know, we'd get to a site and, you know, I'd go off look for owls, and he'd, you know, open this thing up and be there for hours fixing our problem, because we were there until the problem was fixed. Luckily, we usually had about a month's worth of food with us. And we were usually right by rivers, so there's water and there were fresh fish, but nonetheless, yeah. And every once in a while, you know, there weren't many people around, but every once in a while, you know, people would stop by. They'd see our truck, they'd come up, they'd knock on the door, they want to know what we're doing, and invariably they want to drink. And so these two guys on the right there showed up one evening. We were parked near one of these radon hot springs, and so you know, they had been heading out to the hot spring from a village that was about 16 kilometers away to drink and soak in the hot spring. Their car broke down, and so, you know, they walked the rest of the way, saw our truck, knocked on the door, was like, "Hey, you know, do you guys want to drink?" And so even in cases like this, where even if we don't, you know, what we want to do is work, or we want to go to sleep, we found out that it really benefits us to be absolutely hospitable and, you know, really engage the people who live in these places year round, because things like this happen where your truck goes through the river and you don't have a winch, and if one of those two guys, you know, knocks on your cabin door the night before, and you tell him to get lost, the next day he passes you next to your car in the river, he's not going to stop. And so over the years, you know, so I've been, you know, so Sergey has been going up to this area since the late 90s. I've been going up there since the mid 2000s, and we still go up to look for owls, do work in these areas. So we've cultivated this network of local contacts, and it benefits everybody. You know, we get meat from these guys. They help us out of rivers. I take special orders and bring over, you know, outdoor supplies that they just simply don't have access to in Russia that I can bring from here. And so it's mutually beneficial. So, okay, so why does any of this matter to most of you who are in Corvallis, or Diana who's in Minnesota? What does it matter what I did 15 years ago in the Russian Far East? Well, I hope I can make some of those connections for you. So this is fish owl habitat, and this is one of these logging roads. You can see the sort of the dirt track that cuts across the river. And if you remember that map I showed you earlier of the 3,000 kilometers of roads, that's what these are. It's all these logging roads that are going through the river valleys, mostly to remove wood. And so these are some GPS locations from 5 owls that we collected data from. It's 2 pairs, so it's but anyway, so you can see that every single one of these birds is in a river valley. They only live in river valleys. Something like 0.14% of our GPS points were outside of a river valley. So right away, we already know that there is significant potential conflict between the needs of humans here and the needs of owls here. And this is what conservation is, right? It's finding solutions that work for both people and for the wildlife, and using science to do it. So, I mentioned that mostly these are logging roads, and there's a tremendous amount of wood coming out of this part of the world, and some of it makes it here. Trees from Primoria become floors in North America, or floors in Europe. The roads provide access for fishing too. Some of it illegal. All these pictures are poaching. But the legal fishing, the salmon from Primoria's waters are sold throughout Asia. So what happens here? So how the landscape is managed to benefit fish owls also benefits the resource extraction, for the people that they're living there and are dependent on these industries, and then the world, I would say, benefits from this as well. So one of the outcomes from the work was, so we figured out where all these owls were going, like what parts of the landscape were most important for them, and we were able to create a map with showing which parts of Primoria essentially are really high quality fish owl habitat and should not be bothered for logging or for road construction. And we gave this map to the dominant logging company, and they are, because suddenly there's a management plan, or there's a plan, they are now legally obligated to follow that. And it's not really a conflict situation like the spotted owl in the Pacific Northwest. Here, some of these trees that the owls are nesting in are, they're essentially commercially worthless. So these old decaying things that have no value. So loggers aren't being put out financially by not cutting down some of these big trees. And as far as where their roads go, a lot of these valleys are pretty wide. So we say, okay, look, here's a really important patch of forest for fish owls. Over here, they say, fine, we'll just put the road in over here. And then it's win-win. Another thing we've been doing with the dominant logging company in the region is identifying where some of these roads are that the logging company isn't using anymore, but still exist, but are also high biodiversity areas for, not just for fish owls, but for tigers and bears and all the wildlife in Primoria. And then strategically closing down some of these roads, or reducing access to these roads, either by these big berms like this, or by taking out bridges at key crossings. And this is the logging company doing this. Like, we're just helping them identify which areas to restrict access to. Now, another thing we've been doing since 2015 is dealing with fish owl nesting. So at the bottom of the screen here, you can see a stump. Now, I don't know if this tree was actually a fish owl nest tree, but it could have been. It was big enough to be. The tree behind it in the distance there, that was. But so the tree in the front was cut down to build a bridge. And then the tree in back, which had been a fish owl nest, was knocked over in a storm. There was this one territory where for a decade we've been monitoring these birds. There's the same pair living there for a decade, and over those 10 years we found that they had gone through 4 different nest trees because they just either something gets harvested, the whole thing gets knocked down in a storm, or the cavity, the hole actually decays too deep. so that the owl can't really climb in and out of it anymore. So most of the losses are natural. It's not because of us, of humans, it's just because the trees are only good as Fishel Nest trees for a few years. And so in 2015, Sergey and I revisited this site, and the owls were still there, but they weren't breeding because there were no more trees left. So we took a cue from our Japanese colleagues who have essentially doubled the fish owl population in Japan from fewer than 100 birds to nearly 200 birds in a 20-year period, largely by putting up nest boxes. So this is just like a 55-gallon drum. This used to have soybean oil in it. Cut a hole in the side, screw a perch to it, and then we put it up in this tree at this one territory. And we put a camera up there too, a motion sensor camera, just to see if the owls would find it and what they would do. It took them like a week and a half to find it. So we're essentially putting this barrel in a tree, and it took the owls like 9 days to find it. And they bred in there. This is now their primary nesting site, and they've raised a number of chicks since 2015 in this box. And I have to say that this story for me is very satisfying. A lot of wildlife conservation, I'm sure, like many professions, it's filled with uncertainty. People like me can design studies, collect data, and use that information to develop these conservation plans. But it's hard to know sometimes if these recommendations and these management actions are actually doing anything. But here's a case where Sergey and I we strapped some barrels to trees, and there are fish owls like flapping around Primoria now because of that, and because we're blocking off access to fish owl habitat, or we're setting aside certain parts of fish owl habitat from logging interference. And so we're not saving the whole species here. We think there's a few hundred fish owls that live in Primoria out of 500 to 850 pairs total. So we're not saving a species, but I do think what we're doing matters to the few hundred that live in Primoria. Although I will say that the fish owls do not always appreciate our efforts. Thank you. That's what I have, and I'm eager for any questions if you have them.
Well, thank you for such a captivating presentation. That was so interesting. So many questions, I'm sure. I do see in the chat, it looks like Hinaguchi was wondering about recent roads. Do you want to ask about that and clarify what you mean? Sorry, I don't know your first name.
And you're muted.
My first name is Nancy.
Nancy, yeah.
And I just wanted to know, you've already clarified it really, that they're logging roads. I wasn't sure why there were so many roads, though, all at once. Is it because the company just got the right to the land, or the tigers quit eating them, or what?
Yeah, so it's selective logging there. And yes, it's been very much accelerated in recent decades. And even in the last, so the photo I showed of the helicopter flying into that northern village, that was 2006. I mean, you can drive there now. You couldn't before. So it continues to push north, the road network. But because it's selective logging, they put the roads in and then leave them there because they plan to come back in 20 years, 30 years to reharvest in that area. And generally speaking, the selective logging that goes on isn't that bad for, it's not habitat destruction. It's definitely habitat modification. But there's some tiger biologists that argue that the selective logging is actually, on its own, good for tigers because it opens up the canopy, promotes this understory growth, which brings in the deer and the boar and other things that the tigers then eat. The problem is the roads, because that then gives access. So anyone can drive in there. People drive these roads, spotlighting, shooting things. They go in, even if they're not poaching, people will go in and just have campfires. They'll go out and have a nice afternoon in nature. And, you guys know about this on the West Coast right now. You know, that these things get out of control and burn tremendous swaths of forest. And so it's really like the roads are really driving all this. And so that's, it's been a big focus of my work the last few years. And depending on who I'm talking to, I'm either saying we're blocking road access for the owls, we're blocking road access for the tigers, you know, depending on if it's a mammal or a bird person, but it's all the same effect. Yeah.
John, this is Melissa Lindsay. I'm another one from Minnesota.
Oh,
How are
yeah,
you?
sure, right. Yeah, you're the Minnesota Zoo Foundation.
Yes, I was. So my question is, am I really here? Am I just being hopeful in this comment that at least in the area in which you're working, you're really not seeing any pushback from either the residents or industry in terms of preserving this species? Or really, and is that in general for that whole area that they're receptive to conservationists coming in and protecting their wildlife?
Well, I mean, fish owls remain mostly off of everybody's radar, so people don't usually care about the owls. And you know, in many cases, like they think there must be that we must be playing some other angle. You know, they can't imagine that, you know, we're spending all this time and energy to study a bird. It just doesn't make sense. Like, obviously, so even some, I mentioned this, like this network of locals that we've cultivated. You know, there are people that I consider friends, and even now, you know, they'd be like, so like, you're selling those to zoos, aren't you? You're catching them and selling them to zoos. They just can't grasp that. You know, tigers, on the other hand, I mean, some people like tigers, a lot of people don't. Just, you know, they're viewed as competitors, right? You know, most of the people in these villages rely on the forests to feed themselves, and so having a giant thing out there that's also eating deer is viewed as a threat. So I think it's probably the same in the United States, right, where largely people from urban areas are much more receptive to and supportive of conservation than people in rural communities. I mean, Vladivostok, you know, the city of 1 million people, they have this Tiger Day event every year. It was supposed to be this weekend, actually, but you know, COVID, where they have 50,000 people. The city shuts down, and there's these parades. There's, you know, there's senior citizens, you know, with their faces painted like tigers and wearing these little tiger hats, because everybody loves tigers in Vladivostok. But then you go actually out into you know, the forests, where the people live there actually have a legitimate chance of encountering a tiger in the forest. Then people are less receptive. And so some poaching isn't really, they're not making money off of it. They just want to shoot a tiger to eliminate the competitor. So it's a mixed bag, I guess, just like anywhere. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it did. Thank you.
Does anyone have
Well, I
another?
have another. Oops, go ahead.
Please.
No, I was just going to ask John, did you ever encounter any of the Amur tigers or the brown bears in your field studies?
Yes. Let me start off by saying that I feel very comfortable with tigers in the forest. Tigers are, the ones in Russia are generally not a threat to humans. And I don't think it's because they're nicer than tigers in Bangladesh, for example. But a colleague of mine did a study of a number of dead tigers, where she took a metal detector to them, and she found something like 3/4 of the tigers that she examined had bullets in them, old bullets. So you know, most people who take a shot at a tiger in the woods, they don't have the type of ammunition that will actually take down a tiger. They're out hunting deer, they're out hunting grouse, and they see the tiger, decide to take a shot at it. And so these tigers are wounded, they're shot, they're not life-threatening wounds, but they're walking around carrying, you know, a dozen bullets in them. And so the tigers in Russia, they do not want to encounter a human, because most of the humans that they encounter in the woods are armed. So they flee. And there are you know, a few years ago, there was I was doing, it was after it was 2015, we were looking for owls, and Sergey and I were working, you know, kind of working our way up the river looking for owls. At the same time, there was a female tiger working her way down the river because, you know, she was just patrolling her territory. And so we'd encounter her tracks all the time. And at one point, we'd come around the corner, and you know, you can see her tracks, and they come right up to us, and then boom, you know, they're off into the brush. You know, so she had heard us coming and bolted, and was probably sitting somewhere there watching us, but you know, just sitting and watching and waiting for us to go. And then, like the next day, as we were sleeping, she came up and walked around our camp, and then kept going. So as far as like tiger sign, like we would see tracks all the time. As far as seeing an actual cat, I only saw tigers when I was doing work specifically looking for tigers, you know, doing, you know, some of my other non-owl work. And with the bears, I don't like bears, but they're all hibernating during Fishel fieldwork, which is winter. So I feel like, yeah, that's great. I don't like bears.
Sounds like Stephen Johnson. Do you have a hand raised?
Yeah. Hi, Jonathan. Thank you. Really fascinating stories you've got. I was wondering, what's the next phase of the research that you have planned for the owls?
Great. Yeah. So this is the fish owl work is approximately 5% of my job duties now. It's like a pet project, and it's almost the same for Sergey, where, you know, he has a million things to do. I have a million things to do. Every year we manage to put together a grant to go do something. We're always doing something every year. And honestly, I'm really looking for, I'm looking for a graduate student. You know, we have these ideas. You know, we need to find someone like, you know, 25-year-old John, who can throw his life into this, do it for, you know, spend 5 years, 4 or 5 years focusing on this one thing and only doing that, to learn more about Fishel behavior, for example, because there's so much is yet to be discovered. One thing we've been doing is every year we've been going to nature reserves that are in Fishel habitat, and just helping them understand where their owls are, how to look for owls, how to look for fish owls, to just establish baseline monitoring data, because the owls are cryptic, they're hard to find. And, you know, it's an endangered species. And if we have this network of people in protected areas across at least the southern part of their range, who are doing these surveys on an annual basis, we then get a better sense of how the population trajectory is going, rather than just me and Sergey doing what we can when we can. So yeah, I mean, there are a couple ideas we have for graduate students, and honestly, I'm hoping that all the press this book is getting is going to help bring some students out of the woodwork.
Has there been any, follow-up, has there been any interest from local Russian students in carrying on that graduate work with you?
A little bit, yes. And that's, you know, one thing that my organization, the Wildlife Conservation Society, what we try to do in Russia is not just have people like me go there and do the work. We're really interested in bringing Russians into it. And there are problems with that, most of them socioeconomic. I mean, this type of work doesn't pay much, and it's hard to convince someone to devote their lives to something that they're not going to make any money doing. And, you know, Russians marry young, they have kids young, and if you've got kids and a family, it's hard to justify doing something that's your passion. But so what we do try to do is, and this is working with what we with our tiger work, is pair up projects. So we have a foreign student and a Russian student working on one idea, but just different facets of it. So they, you know, each, you know, the Russian and the foreign student can both get degrees from the work that complement each other. So, and, you know, Sergey Strumich's daughter is doing a PhD in fish owls right now. But I feel like we need to expand beyond the Sergeys and me to bring in some other people.
Diana Houston, it looks like you have a question. If you can speak now, please do. I can read it if you're comfortable with that. Okay. Diana is asking, what's your favorite story that didn't make it into the book?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stories. I don't know. I mean, there are a number of things that were left out for, I don't know, political reasons is the right word, but I want to keep working in Russia. I want to keep having relationships with some of these people, and I can't say everything, or either the government wouldn't let me come back, or somebody would just stop helping. So there are a lot of stories like that. Yeah, off the top of my head, I do remember. So one winter, we're working out of this site that there's one of these radon hot springs, and I talk about this in the book where I'd gotten sick. I don't know if it was from drinking radon water or not. So I was like, I'm going to go, I'm not going to drink any more of this radon water. I'm going to go down to this other spot that was far away, but there's some open water there. And, that's where I'm going to get all my water. So I spent a week or two going really out of my way to just go to this one place to get my water because it's clean. And it was like springtime, right? It was turning into spring. And so as it gets, as spring goes on and the days are getting warmer, the patch of open water where I was getting my water, expanded and expanded. And pretty soon, I noticed that, a meter, just like a couple feet away from where I've been getting my water for 2 weeks, there's a dead deer in the river, just sitting there. And it had been there all winter. I didn't see it. I was like drinking my clean water, which is dead deer water. So that's one thing.
Thank you for sharing that story. That's pretty gnarly. One last question before we go. Looks like it's from Tisha Magner. If you to ask, I don't see a Tisha here. Oh, yes.
She is, yeah. If she's there, you're muted, Tisha. I don't know if you can hear us. But
I'm going to read the
there. Is that better?
Yes, there we go.
Okay. I apologize for the screen being backwards, and I'm not tech savvy enough to fix it. I was wondering if you were talking about finding a graduate student or somebody to do the work. I was wondering if you'd ever heard of an organization called Earthwatch. I
have, yeah, and we've thought about that. So my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, it's an organization that links volunteers to specific conservation projects. Is that correct?
For the most part, but they work with the scientists too.
Right.
So
Yeah.
they might be able to help you with, what they do is they put out expeditions. So they get a number of volunteers to work with a scientist in whatever country, they're worldwide. But they may be able, since they do so much work with the scientists, they may be able to help you kind of screen people that way and possibly find a volunteer.
Yeah, we've looked into it. I don't know how in depth we have looked into it, but so a major issue with the Fishel work and just work in this specific part of the world in general is that almost nobody speaks English, and conditions are rough. So it's difficult to, and so that's something we're looking for in a student, is someone who has some basic Russian skills, which is also, that's a limiting factor, as Ashley and I discussed earlier. So, I mean, bringing over people who don't speak Russian, who aren't necessarily going to want to live in a truck with 4 other dudes.
Oh, yeah.
And just, registering foreigners is a big deal over there. Like, the Russian government thinks everyone's spying. So we try to keep it as small as possible. And most people who come over to do tiger stuff have at least basic knowledge of the Russian language. They can at least have basic conversations with people.
Yeah, I can understand. You need to be fluent.
You don't have to be fluent, but you have to at least be able to, say watch out, or understand what watch out is.
Yeah. Thanks. I absolutely am loving the book. I'm not through it yet, but
oh, great, thanks.
It's awesome. And I would order a t-shirt, but I don't have PayPal. Oh. Right?
I think that Diana's wearing a t-shirt.
Yeah, I saw it at the beginning. I don't know if I still have her on there, but
it's just the Fishel tracks.
Yeah, it's cool though. It's awesome.
Thanks.
If I wasn't an old lady, I'd go. Well, I'd have to learn Russian first.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, everyone, for being here and participating in this really interesting presentation from Jonathan Slaght. I encourage all of you, of course, to buy his book, preferably through Grassroots. And Jonathan, thank you for being here and telling these stories to us. It was really
thank you. It was absolutely my pleasure.
I am going to leave the meeting now. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wonderful to see
Thank
everyone.
you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.